16 notes. Just notes. The next 16 notes. So, are you bored yet? So, that was a little boring. That's the way I played the piece when I was 12 years old. I played it fast with absolutely no musical understanding. My teacher said, just play it in tune and play it evenly, and that's what you're going to go for. So I still have a recording that got me a scholarship to Interlaken when I was 12, that it surfaced some years back, and I listened to that and thought, oh boy, that's a starting point. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can do something that might be interesting with 2 pages of 16th notes, which is basically the prelude of the first Bach suite. It's just pages of 16th notes. My teacher, Janos Starker, one day said, how do we find our way through this maze? So it's like, yeah, good question. As I've mentioned to you before, once we get to the Beethoven sonatas, for example, there are all kinds of instructions in the piece about when to be soft, when to be medium, when to be loud, when to be really loud. Some notes have sforzando or a strong accent on them. There are diminuendos or decrescendos telling you to get softer. There's the opposite of that, crescendos that tell you to get louder. None of those instructions appears in the Bach suites. There's not, with one exception, there's one place where he marked the first bar forte and the second bar piano, in the 6th suite, I believe. But the rest of the suites have absolutely no clues about what to do. So it's a problem, or it's an opportunity. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the suggestions I make to students when they're trying to learn this piece, to avoid the cardinal sin, which Pablo Casals said, the worst enemy of music is monotony. Monotony. Well, if you play all the notes very nicely with a good sound in tune, but everybody's bored, then the whole audience thinks that's because classical music is boring, which we all know it isn't. But if somebody is skilled and plays well, but it's really boring, then it's not really obvious that it's the fault of the player. And so people think, well, it's just because Bach is boring, mathematically worthy of respect, but not containing anything that interesting or anything emotional. And they even would say that about Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms. You can ruin anything if you don't have some imagination and experiment. Okay, so I wanted to show you some of the choices that cellists have when they play the prelude of the first Bach suite. There's a phrase in string playing called in a bow or in the bow. You could say, I'm playing 4 notes in a bow, meaning you don't change the bow direction until you've played 4 notes. Or you can play 1 note in a bow and you change the bow direction on every single note. Or 2 or 3, or you can mix it up. So let's say that I played the first bar or 2 of the prelude with just 1 note on the bow. Kind of choppy. So how about 2 notes in a bow? Or 4 notes in a bow. So or the way I played it for you at first, 8 notes in a bow. The manuscript of the Bach suites is gone. It disappeared, and it will probably never be located. We have the manuscript written down by Bach's wife, Anna Magdalena Bach. And that's the closest thing we have to the source. And so people look at that and say, you need to pay a whole lot of attention to what's there because we don't have the manuscript. And so let's see what Anna Magdalena wrote down in terms of bowings. Well, as you might know, there were many, many children running around Bach's house. At some point, I think there were like 15 children or something in the house. So on the one hand, you can imagine Anna Magdalena sitting in a quiet house at night, you know, faithfully copying her husband's manuscripts of these cello suites that were not written for any purpose, really, not because anybody asked them to do that. And they were never performed in Bach's lifetime, and it was only thanks to Pablo Casals, largely, that cellists started performing these in public, because they were not viewed as being the masterpieces that it turns out that they actually are. But let's say that Anna Magdalena is trying to copy down this manuscript, and every minute or so she's saying, hey, Gottfried, leave your brother alone. What are you doing in there? And hey, Wilhelm, cut it out, you know, and then she goes back and starts writing more stuff down. Well, so it's a question, how really faithful her manuscript is to what Bach wrote down. Also, the question comes up, how much did Bach care about exactly how many notes you put in a bow? Bach was a practical musician. Sometimes he wouldn't mind if a violin piece was played on the cello or a keyboard piece was transcribed for some other instrument. He was not a purist. Casals always used to wince when he talked about the purists. He would say, the purists are scandalized by how I play Bach. And then he would smile. Because when he played the Bach suites, of course he was loved and accepted and adored, and he was also vehemently attacked by the purists who think that they know somehow the way it's supposed to go. And I always think, so were you alive in 1720? Did you know how Bach wanted these things to go? So, we have all kinds of choices. The one thing we can't do is just bore the audience and bore ourselves. If you bore yourself, the audience will be bored probably. So you have to find a way to keep yourself engaged. Well, there's the question of how many notes you put in a bow. I've showed you a few different ways. There's also the problem that the first half of the measure is exactly the same as the second half of the measure. It repeats. So when it repeats, do we want to play it exactly the same way? Maybe not, because that becomes predictable. It becomes monotonous. So what can we do? One thing we can do is change the dynamic or the volume. So we play the first half of the bar stronger with more sound than the second half of the bar. That's already a little bit interesting. Then we could change the bowing. We can change the bowing in the second half of the bar and not do the same grouping in the bow that we do in the first half. That was one of the solutions my teacher came up with, and often when I play this prelude, I play a lot of bowings that that he liked because they seem to solve this particular problem. Then we have another opportunity, and the opportunity is to use rubato. And probably a lot of you know this word, rubato. It means literally robbed time or stolen time, which means that you emphasize a note or give it importance by holding it a little longer. And then, so the whole tempo doesn't go out the window, you have to speed up some other notes. So the basic pulse, there's got to be some pulse in there. We all have one, and it's sort of regular. That's why we're all upright and here. It speeds up, of course, sometimes, and it slows down, but hopefully there's a pulse. That's why musicians speak about the pulse in a piece. The regularity of the tempo, which kind of is the glue that holds the whole thing together. So you can use your rubato in kind of a subtle way. Or you could be way more obvious. Sounds ridiculous, right? Proportion. Everything needs to be in proportion. So a sense of proportion, a sense of order, the idea of something being maybe understated or implied or subtle goes a long way. It goes a long way, and it doesn't disturb the perfect mathematical order of a piece like the Bach Prelude. Yeah, if you played the way I just played, it would distort the whole piece all over the place, and you would just be kind of making a display of like, look, I'm using all kinds of rubato. Well, so what? I mean, the best kind of rubato, I think, is one that's not noticed too obviously, that everybody would say, oh yeah, listen to that note, he's holding that note extra long, maybe that's a special note, maybe it means something. On the other hand, you don't want to avoid rubato because then you're playing like typing, yes. So it's just too regular and too monotonous and predictable. The one other thing that I will mention before I play the prelude is that Casals said, one guideline is when the notes ascend and get higher, make a crescendo and get more sound. And when the notes descend and get lower, try making a diminuendo and getting softer. It's natural. He said it's natural. Well, that's a wonderful, simple idea that gives you something to experiment with. And what I always encourage my students to do is just try something. If I've got a student who's playing not with discipline and control, then I will try to get them to play very regular and even notes. But once they're able to play it very regularly with really even notes, then it's just boring. So then I say, okay, so now what can you do so that you stay engaged in this piece and that somebody listening to it thinks, wow, that's a beautiful piece, and not, oh yeah, that's that boring Bach that just keeps going the same way for 3 minutes. And sometimes they look a little lost when I ask them to try things. So I always say, just arbitrarily try anything. It's better than nothing. And if you overdo it, I promise you, I will say, rein it in, don't do so much of this, that, or the other thing. But any idea is better than no idea at all. So I've been playing this Bach suite for, I was thinking backstage, 64 years. And so I would hope that now I play it differently than I did when I was 12, because I've had so much experience with it, and the way I play it has changed so much over the years. So as I mentioned to you the other night, we didn't have time for any questions after all my students played, and I was so proud of them, how they did, and that class went long. So I'm sorry we didn't have time for questions, but I think I mentioned last week that one of the things that Starker always said was the definition of a masterpiece is you can play it with a lot of notes in one bow very smooth, or you can play it just much more like talking rather than singing, which is something they like to do in the Baroque period. You can play it slow or fast or in between. You can play it loud or soft. You can play with vibrato, or you can use no vibrato at all. And it still sounds like a really great piece with all of those different approaches, because it's a masterpiece, which in a sense was a relief to hear. And then he said, as opposed to like a third-rate piece, that if you play this certain way, it sounds really wonderful. But if you don't play in that particular way, you choose the wrong tempo, the style is wrong, then it sounds like a bad piece. It's hard to make these Bach suites sound like bad pieces of music. So it gave us respect for the piece, but also it was kind of reassuring, giving us permission to experiment and try different things, different speeds, different ways of playing it. So having said all of this, I'll play the Prelude for you. Thank you. So I hope it wasn't boring. And one of the blessings of playing a piece for so many years is that I don't always play it the same way. I change the bowing, I change the shape of the piece sometimes. So in the moment that I was playing it for you, I was trying things, some of which I've done before, some of which maybe were a little different, and that only happens after you're really familiar with something and it becomes like a friend to you. So then you can act this way or that way or try this out or that, and you still remain friends. So I'm going to play the whole